Generally speaking, there's a reason as to where and when you can find Pokemon. Strong Pokemon either take a lot of grinding to get or can be found in late game areas, while weak Pokemon can be found easily on earlier routes. However, sometimes Pokemon don't follow this rule, especially in Gen 1. There are some very weak Pokemon that take a strange amount of effort to obtain in these games, or that are only available in the strangest of places. So today we're going to go over some of the weirdly rare Pokemon of Generation 1. And starting off at number 10, we have Marowak. This is a pure ground type that is overall just not that good. You have the average attack and good defense, but your other stats are awful, and your level up moves are genuinely sad. You don't get a ground type attack until level 48 if you evolve your Cubone into Marowak at the first opportunity. Overall, you're better off using just about any other ground type Pokemon, even the also not that great Sandslash. However, for some reason, despite this Pokemon being quite garbage, you can only find it in a couple of locations. Cubone can be found in the Pokemon Tower on a bit of a low chance for the encounter, but it's not all that hard to find it there if, for some reason, you really want to use Marowak. However, that's basically the only place where you can find a Marowak. The only other place a member of the Marowak line shows up is in Victory Road in Cerulean Cave. And Cerulean Cave is post-game, so that really only leaves Victory Road. Pokemon in Victory Road are basically never added to a player's team, as at that point you should have your squad of 6 ready to go already. So the only practical place where you can find Cubone is at the Pokemon Tower for a playthrough. And at first, that kind of makes sense. The story beat in the Pokemon Tower is about Team Rocket killing a Cubone's mother, and the player needing to help set its soul at ease. Obviously, you would find Cubone in the Pokemon Tower. That's where the Cubone story beat is. However, that doesn't explain the utter lack of Cubone anywhere else in the game. The Ghastly line only appeared in a graveyard makes sense because they're ghosts. They should be around spooky areas and around places of remembrance. But the only places you can see Cubone are across the map from the Pokemon Tower. Did the entire Cubone population make a pilgrimage to the Pokemon Tower just to mourn the death of one of their kind's mother? It's a bit strange when you think about it. Overall, the lack of Marowak in the wild doesn't make that much sense from a story or game balance perspective. They could have just added them in wherever the other ground types spawn, but instead, there's a strange lack of Cubone throughout the entire Kanto region that raises far more questions than it answers. And at number 9, we have Mr. Mime. This is a pretty average, pure psychic type that's mostly known for their endless meme potential. It has okay speed and special, but the rest of its stats are quite bad. And its move pool leaves a bit to be desired. In terms of just trying to get through the game, you're probably better off just using a Kadabra, even if you can't evolve it the rest of the way due to the lack of trading. This is one of the few Pokemon who will appear on this list that can only be found via trade, appearing nowhere in the wild in the game. This is a pretty available trade though, as you can get it on Route 2 right outside of Diglett's Cave. All of this would seem as if it would make it a pretty useful Pokemon to pick up, right? Well, that's before you account for the Pokemon you have to give up to get the weird little guy. The trainer asks for an Abra, which presents a couple of problems. First off, Abra is only available on routes 24 and 25, which surround Cerulean City. So to get this trade, you'll have to catch an Abra, and then backtrack to get Mr. Mime. This is an even bigger problem because you can't actually do that backtracking until you either get Fly or have access to Diglett's Cave next to Vermilion City, which is a huge way after you get your first Abra. By that time, you can probably have your Abra evolve into a Kadabra, which is what we said earlier is a far better Pokemon than Mr. Mime. From a game balance perspective, this trade doesn't serve much of a purpose. It lets you trade a Pokemon that evolves into a far stronger Pokemon way later in the game than when you first get access to that Pokemon, and it doesn't even match up well into many of the gyms or anything. Story-wise, the trade is also a bit strange. It's not like Mr. Mime is an exotic animal that you're getting from someone who's been traveling, or a common Pokemon that you're trading for another common Pokemon. It's a bit hard to imagine what the story is here, but then again, that may be because it's hard to imagine how Mr. Mime fits into the world at all, given that it's, well, Mr. Mime. Still, this trade is very strange. It takes a lot of extra effort to get Mr. Mime, and you can only get one in the game thanks to the lack of breeding in Gen 1, making it quite rare despite being an awful Pokemon. And at number 8, we have Scyther and Pinsir, a pair of Pokemon that are both version exclusive. Both of these Pokemon are only found in the Safari Zone. Scyther in red and Pinsir in blue. Scyther is a flying/bug type with great attack and speed. and Pinsir is a pure bug type with great attack and defense and average speed. These are the premium bugs of Gen 1, and they're obviously supposed to be quite powerful. However, they kind of have a big problem, and that's that they basically don't get any good moves. Good bug-type moves were a myth until around Gen 5, when we finally started getting attacks like Bug Buzz and Skitter Smack. Before then, you had to use garbage like Twin Needle for your Bug Stab, or else you gave up that juicy 50% damage boost. Though neither of these bugs gave you much of a choice, as they just don't get Bug Stabs at all in Gen 1, because the devs were very overworked and had a lot on their minds at the time. While you do have some attacks like Slash and Swords Dance, which are pretty good, it's hard to make up for the lack of coverage and no stab. The end result is that these big, bad bugs are a bit of a bust. Even worse is that these Pokemon are only in the Safari Zone, which is famous for being a fun and easy to interact with mechanic in Gen 1. I'm being sarcastic, of course. The Safari Zone is extremely frustrating, and these Pokemon are quite rare in it, with encounter rates of 1 to 4%. Finding your Scyther or Pinsir will be a huge pain, and that's not even accounting for getting lucky and actually catching those things. These bugs may be tough, but they don't bite as hard as they should, and are frustrating to get a hold of, to put things mildly. If you really want to use a Pinsir or a Scyther, just wait a couple of gems for them to actually get good move pulls. You'll have a lot more fun then. And at number 7, we have Lickitung. This is a pure normal type with slightly above average HP and awful literally everything else in stats. It's another Pokemon you can only get from an in-game trade, and it makes this list in part just because of how awful of an idea actually going through with this trade is. We've discussed this Pokemon before, but this really might be one of the worst trades in the history of Pokemon. The Pokemon you have to trade for Lickitung is Slowbro, an amazing water psychic type that will only reach that stage at level 37. This means that you either have to get one at one of the few locations you can get a fully evolved Slowbro, or catch a wild Slowbro and go through the rigorous process of training it up to nearly level 40. Slowpoke is not a good Pokemon, but once you finally do the work to get a Slowbro, it's one of the better Pokemon in the game. It has great bulk, access to the stupidly good amnesia, and has great typing. You can absolutely rock a Slowbro into the late game, whereas Lickitung would have a hard time in the first gym of the game. Granted, that's partially because it's a rock gym, which is a rough type matchup, but it's not good for any other important battles either. The only reason to get Lickitung is to fill your Pokedex, which is a completely optional goal. The only reason I can think of to use Lickitung is if you think that Generation 1 is too easy and you want to give yourself a self-imposed challenge. The Pokemon is dead weight, and it feels like it was just shoved into the game last minute to round out the cast to an even 150 Pokemon. And at number 6, we have Raichu. This is a pretty middling pure electric type with high speed, a pretty solid attack and special, but below average everything else, leaving it as a bit of a frail and fast electric type. It of course evolves from Pikachu, the easily available mascot of the franchise. Pikachu can be found very early on in a playthrough, popping up in Viridian Forest, one of the earliest areas in the game. It also does show up in the power plant, but that's pretty late into the game, so it's not all that important. However, Raichu has a very strange property, in that there's no way to get one in Pokemon Yellow without trading. That may sound strange at first, but once you start to think about it, you figure out pretty quickly why this is. As we all know, you start Yellow version with a Pikachu as your partner, instead of one of the 3 iconic starters. And you probably remember that your partner Pikachu was unable to evolve in those games. That's pretty obvious, but one thing you may have overlooked is that wild Pikachu have been completely removed from the game as well. This is probably to keep it in line with the other starters, as all of them cannot be found in the wild either. It would be weird to start the game with a Pokemon that's supposed to be special, only to find more in the wild after all. So wild Pikachu were removed from Viridian Forest and the power plant. This is all pretty well known, but the implications of these changes are kind of surprising. Without being able to evolve your partner Pikachu or find more Pikachu in the wild, where are you supposed to find a Raichu? Well, the simple answer is you don't. The lack of Raichu in Pokemon Yellow version is something that should be more obvious than it is. It's very easy to forget the small changes that result in this electric mouse disappearing from the game entirely. And once you realize that it's just not there, it feels very strange. And at number 5, we have Magmar and Electabuzz. These are another pair of version exclusives, and they're generally alright. Magmar is a bit weaker than it should be thanks to investing some stats in its physical attack, despite being fire type, that wants to spam fire-type moves, but they're more than usable. They are still quite rare. Magmar can only be found in the Pokemon Mansion in blue version, and Electabuzz can only be found in the Power Plant in red version, and both of them are found at pretty low encounter rates. If you want to use either of these Pokemon on your team, you're gonna have to do a bit of searching. But it's not that bad when compared to how frustrating getting a Pinsir from the Safari Zone is. Now, what gets this pair onto this list is how you get them in yellow version, or more accurately, how you can't. For some reason, these Pokemon were removed from their homes in the improved yellow version, meaning that they can each only be obtained in one of the 3 games in Generation 1. This is just one of the weirdest moves Game Freak could have pulled. At least throw them into Cerulean Cave so that there's some place yellow players can finish more of their Pokedex. That's what you did with garbage like Lickitung in yellow version. I'm sure people would have appreciated getting Magmar or Electabuzz a lot more than the Tongue Salamander. Overall, this is just a strange gap in the Pokemon's availability that it's hard to ignore. And at number 4, we have Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee. These are a pair of fighting types that each have sky-high attack and decent speed, but the rest of their stats are pretty bad. Now, these are a pair of gift Pokemon found in the Saffron City Fighting Dojo. Once you make your way through all the trainers in the dojo, you'll receive one of the 2 as a gift, though your choice here doesn't really matter, as they're both quite bad. It seems like Hitmons were supposed to be strong Pokemon, but in practice they're extremely mediocre. Fighting was actually kind of a trash type in Gen 1, as the best fighting type move is Submission, which is inaccurate, does recoil damage, and doesn't even have that high base power. Hitmonlee at least gets high jump kick, but even with this better fighting type move, the Pokemon just aren't all that strong. Worst of all is their miserable special stat. Not only does this mean that just about any special move will deal massive damage to them, thanks to them both having quite bad HP, this also means that their special moves do basically nothing. This is really bad for Hitmonchan, whose main upside is supposed to be having the elemental punches. But its special is so low that even these coverage moves hitting for super effective damage often does less damage than just using Submission. And Submission is awful. So that really shows you how bad the chance special punches are. They're too frail and their attack stats aren't high enough to really put in that much work. This miscalculation of the Hitmon's power levels is what leads to them landing on this list, and they're treated like powerful rare Pokemon that you have to put in effort to obtain, but in fact are pretty much useless in this generation. The end result are Pokemon that are extremely rare that simply shouldn't be. And at number 3, we have Muk and Weezing. These are a pair of pure poison types with very defensive spreads. Muk has sky-high HP and attack stats, while Weezing has huge defense stats. Outside of these stats, the other stats are below average, and they're both very slow. Overall, they're pretty mediocre Pokemon, which makes a lot of sense as Team Rocket grunts love to throw these guys at you in battle. You'll see a ton of Muk and Weezings throughout your journey through Kanto, to the point that you really get tired of the pollution duo. You'd assume from how many Rocket grunts toss these guys out that they're pretty common Pokemon. Most of the Pokemon that the Rock grunts use are pretty common Pokemon after all. However, for some reason, you can't get Muk and Weezing anywhere except for one location, the Pokemon Mansion. This is located on Cinnabar Island, meaning that by the time you have access to these incredibly middling poison types, you'll have to have gone through most of the game and be ready for the 7th gym. Even worse, Kanto is absolutely crawling with poison types. Vileplume and Victory Bell, Gengar, Golbat, Venomoth, you can get poison types all over the place. You can hardly go 3 steps without literally running into a poison type Pokemon in this region. And even more important, basically all of these poison types are better than Muk and Weezing. Most of them will at least have a secondary type to give you more offensive pressure. The only claim to fame these guys have is that Weezing naturally learns how to turn itself into a bomb by level up, and outside of that, they're pretty much useless. You really have to wonder why they didn't put them in at least a couple of extra places early on where the Pokemon might actually be useful, instead of hiding them basically at the end of the game. It's a puzzling decision no matter how you look at it. And at number 2, we have Porygon. This is a pure normal type that doesn't even pretend to be good. All of its stats are below average to straight up bad. Its move pool is fine, but nothing worth writing home about. leaving it as nothing but early game fodder that's honestly less useful than something like Beedrill. Now, famously, Porygon has a very strange obtainment method. Rather than being able to be found in the wild, you have to win a Porygon from the game corner in Celadon City. This makes it an extremely rare Pokemon, as every other Pokemon you can get from the game corner is able to obtain more easily somewhere else. Getting these Pokemon at all is also quite the challenge, as getting the Pokecoins you need isn't even close to consistent. You can buy them at a rate of 50 Pokecoins for 1,000 Pokédollars, and while getting money isn't all that hard, even in Gen 1 where money grinding methods are extremely non-existent, the conversion rate here is awful. The only other way to get these coins is by gambling on the slot machines, and that's the definition of inconsistent. Still, it can't be that bad, right? How many coins do you need for a Porygon? Oh, only 6,500 coins. The most of any Pokemon at the game corner. And Arceus forbid you want to get a Porygon in red version. There, it's a laughable 9,999 coins for some reason. This means that Porygon cost an insane 130,000 Pokédollars, or nearly 200,000 Pokédollars to get. This is an insane amount of money. So you're essentially required to go and gamble for hours on end to get yourself a Porygon. The end result is that Porygon is one of the most frustrating Pokemon to obtain in the game, and for basically no reason. Now, there is an explanation. Porygon is, in lore, an artificial Pokemon. It's quite rare in the world of Pokemon, so it being so expensive makes some amount of sense. Still, it being so hard to get this Pokemon, only having an in-universe explanation, remains a huge head-scratcher. And at number 1, we have Farfetch'd. This is yet another normal flying type, except it has all around bad stats. Everything is around 60, quite low for a fully evolved Pokemon. There is exactly one Farfetch'd in all of Kanto, with the exception of Yellow version, and it's found in a trade in Vermilion City. The trainer asks for a Spearow, another normal/flying type that is, all around, weaker than Farfetch'd. So it kind of looks like this is a good trade, right? Well, that's only if you ignore the fact that Spearow can evolve into Fearow, a Pokemon that is far better than Farfetch'd in Gen 1, and it does so at level 20. Level 20 is around the level of the Vermilion City Gym. So if you're using your Spearow at all, it should become a better bird than Farfetch'd would ever be before you even find the trainer to trade for the Farfetch'd. This has basically all the traits of a weirdly rare Pokemon we've discussed so far. It's an awful Pokemon that you have to trade a far better Pokemon to get, and it shows up too late in the game to really be worth it anyways. However, the thing about Farfetch'd that gets it so high on this list is that it has a story. You may know this story already, but for the uninitiated, Farfetch'd has a very specific origin. There's an old saying in Japan about a duck that comes bearing onions. Essentially, a duck coming with all the ingredients you'd want to cook. The idea is that it's something so convenient that it would never happen. Or in other words, it's something that's far-fetched, hence the translated name. This is a common bit of trivia nowadays, and it kind of explains why Farfetch'd exists. It's a joke, a pun of an old Japanese saying. However, that doesn't help explain its existence to anyone who's played these games back in the day. While the internet makes these kinds of things easy to find, back in the 90s when the games came out, almost no one would have understood why Farfetch'd was named that or what it was even doing here. To an American audience at the time, this is one of the weirdest Pokemon in the game, period. Not to mention how weird it was that you could only get one of them. Farfetch'd isn't the strangest decision ever once you get all the context, but the fact that Game Freak puts in this one-off joke Pokemon into their games must have been one of the most puzzling things about this series for a lot of early fans.